Audio check. Greetings to the House, fellow panelists, and all dignitaries present here. We, the people of Nalsar, present to you the third edition of the Student Bar Debate. On the motion, this House prefers the abolition of contractual labor system over its reform. I'm Arif, a third-year student of Nalsar, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. The debate will follow a parliamentary-style debating format where we'll have a government and opposition. These roles are not necessarily technical, but rather the proponents and opponents of the motion. The format will have one speaker from the government followed by one speaker from the opposition. This is to ensure that there is diagonal engagement among both the sides of the House. Before contextualizing the motion, I would like to introduce the speaker. From side government, we have Mr. Shaikh Salahuddin. He is the co-founder of the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers, IFAT, founder and president of the TGWU and chairman of TTD-JAC. These initiatives were taken by him upon realizing the exploitation that gig workers faced from companies like Ola, Uber, Swiggy, etc. We welcome you, sir. Secondly, from side government, we have Mr. Sudarshan Rao, an advocate, regional secretary of the Hind Mahzoor Sabha and joint convener of the Central University's Employees Coordination Commission. He has an experience spanning over 45 years in leading over 50 worker unions. Next, Ms. Rehana is the secretary of Self-Employed Women's Association. She would be speaking alongside Shantaben, who is a grassroots level activist. Secondly, we have Ms. Nandini Sarkar speaking from an employer's perspective. She is the co-founder and director of Sequel with a first-hand experience on how the employer thinks about financial and reputation concerns and responds accordingly to labor issues. Ms. Sarkar will share her invaluable experience on the same. Finally, we have Mr. Devashi Paul, a final year student at Nalsar and final speaker on the side opposition. I welcome all the speakers to the panel. While the panel would be discussing the merits of their contentions, it is imperative to contextualize the motion. Contractual laborers, specifically in the Indian context, undergo systematic exploitation even among the elitist of institutions in the country, especially due to their vulnerable position in the employer and employee relationships, which stems from lack of statutory safeguards and their effective implementation. The social setting cannot be exonerated from this phenomenon either. The primary stakeholders in today's debate would definitely be the working class engaged in such contractual labor, and especially the lower strata of the society with increased layer of vulnerability there. Thus, the question on whether change in the status quo is required in the system is settled for the House, but what is rather debated here is the preference for the mode of change being abolition or reform. With that, I would like to reintroduce the motion to the House. This House prefers the abolition of contractual labor over its reform. In the student bar debate, we take a vote of the audience with regards to their preference to the motion before the debate, and we take a vote after the debate to see the exact impact of the speeches on the perceptions of the audience. With that being said, this House prefers the abolition of contractual labor over its reform. Everybody in favor of them, please raise your hands. There are 13 votes for the motion. Everybody against the motion, please raise your hands. There are 15 votes against the motion. With that being said, I would like to open the floor for the first speaker from the government side, Mr. Shaikh Salahuddin.
Thank you so much. First of all, I will speak Hindi if you're comfortable, everyone. Okay, na? Right. Okay. जो ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट लेबर्स है, ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट लेबर्स गिग इकोनॉमी के अंदर इट्स ओके गीग इकोनॉमी के अंदर कितना इनका रोल है वो आपको मैं बताना चाह रहा हूँ इसमें। पहली बात तो ये गीग वर्कर्स और प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स कौन है? गीग वर्कर्स प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स वो लोग हैं जो ओला, उबर, स्विगी, जोमेटो, अमेजोन, फ्लिपकार्ट जो कंपनी है, ये सारे कंपनी में काम करते हैं। इन लोग का रिलेशनशिप कैसा है बोले तो ऐप के अंदर एक बार एग्रीड बोल के दबाने से कॉन्ट्रैक्ट उनका हो जाता। माने उनका रिलेशनशिप जो है सिर्फ ऐप के अंदर आई अग्रीड बोल के बटन दबाने से जो है उनका कॉन्ट्रैक्ट साइन हो जाता। वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट उनके हाथ में फिजिकल कॉपी ना कंपनी देती, ना उनके पास वो ऐप में रहता। वो एक बार आई एग्रीड दबा दिए बाद में वो वहाँ से निकल जाता। ये सबसे बड़ा वहाँ पे प्रॉब्लम है। जो भी गिग वर्कर प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स है उनको उतनी हाईफाई इंग्लिश नहीं आती जो ज़मीन पे काम करते लोग हैं, जो ड्राइवर डिलीवरी बॉयज़ है, उनके लिए बहुत सी कठिन है वो चीज़ पढ़ना। अगर जब वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट आप 48 पेपर्स का कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कभी आप पढ़ेंगे तो उसके अंदर ऐसे क्रिटिकल लॉ वर्ड्स यूज रहते, वो जो ग्राउंड पे काम करते बंदा उसके लिए रिलेशन ही नहीं रखते, उसको समझ में भी नहीं आता। ये सबसे बड़ी दिक्कत आज के तारीख में हो रही थी। जब भी हम गवर्नमेंट के साइड चाहे कंपनी के साइड अगर जा कुछ हमारे पास हथियार है बोले तो एक कॉन्ट्रैक्ट रहता था, मगर वो भी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट जो है अपनी मर्जी माफिक कंपनी कभी भी किधर भी बदला सकती, चेंजेस ला सकती, क्योंकि वो पूरा ऑनलाइन में है। अब रही बात ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट जो है, आप समझ सकते हैं कि कितने ड्राइवर्स और डिलीवरी बॉयज पढ़ते, आप लोग को पता है? उसके अंदर से अगर रेशियो निकालेंगे तो बहुत कम आंकड़ा मिलेगा कि 0.56% जो है कॉन्ट्रैक्ट वहाँ पे पढ़े से लोग दिखेंगे, और वो भी जो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट है पूरा पढ़ नहीं पाते, क्योंकि उसके अंदर लैंग्वेज है, टर्म प्रॉब्लम है, जो हाई क्वालिटी की इंग्लिश इस्तेमाल करी जाती है उसके अंदर, वो सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है। अब रही बात वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट को पकड़ के हम कहाँ पे जा सकते, क्या कर सकते? ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट मॉडल है। जब कॉन्ट्रैक्ट मॉडल निकल के आ गया इसके अंदर, गीग वर्कर्स प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स के अंदर, अनऑर्गेनाइजर वर्कर्स के अंदर, आप देख सकते हैं इंडस्ट्रियल एक कोड है, उसके अंदर कहीं पे भी हम एक जगह फिक्स हो सकते, मगर फिर भी जो है कॉन्ट्रैक्ट किसी के हाथ में नहीं रहने की वजह से सिस्टम पूरा जो है खराब होके है। इसके वजह से आप देखे होंगे जितने भी वर्कर्स है, जो अनऑर्गेनाइजर वर्कर्स के अंदर ऐप बेस्ड वर्कर जो आज का ट्रेंड चल रहा, उनके किसी के हाथ में आज के दिन कॉन्ट्रैक्ट नहीं रहने के वजह से उन लोग उनका ड्यूटी आवर्स क्या है, वर्किंग आवर्स क्या है, सोशल सिक्योरिटी बेनिफिट्स क्या है, वो सारे बेनिफिट्स के जो इनपुट्स है वो भी नहीं ले पा रहे। और गवर्नमेंट से भी जो है फायदा क्या मिल सकता, क्या नहीं मिल सकता, उसका रिलेशन क्या है गवर्नमेंट से, वो भी जो है अधूरा है। ये चीज़ हम पहले समझना चाहिए। और आखिरी बात में इस चीज़ में ये भी आप ज़रूर समझिए कि गीग वर्कर प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स का जो काम करने का तरीका है, जो घंटे 8 घंटे काम करने का, जो लेबर रिलेशन में हम लोग बोलते हैं कि 8 घंटे काम करना चाहिए, अधिक काम करने के ऊपर उनको इंसेंटिव मिलना चाहिए, उनको जो है उनके ऊपर मुआवजा मिलना चाहिए, ओटी मिलना चाहिए, मगर यहाँ पे आप देख सकते ये कुछ नहीं मिलते। आपको कंपनी बोलती कि मर्जी माफिक काम कर सकते, ये हमने कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में लिख के रखा, मगर ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट है क्या असल? एक कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में अगर आप निचोड़ निकालेंगे तो निकलेगा क्या? सवाल ये अभी भी अधूरा है। जब भी अगर जब हम आप कभी भी नज़दीक से देखिए, कभी भी आप भी सारे चीज़ ऑनलाइन पे आजकल आप इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, स्विगी, जोमेटो, ओला, उबर, अमेजोन, फ्लिपकार्ट ऑनलाइन करते वक्त आप कभी उसके टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस निकाल के देखिए। उसके अंदर आपसे भी एक एग्रीमेंट लिया जाता कि ये हम 40 डेज वर्किंग डेज के अंदर रिटर्न ले सकते हैं, ये ऑर्डर रिटर्न नहीं ले सकते, मगर कितने लोग हम लोग वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट पढ़ के आई एग्रीड बोल के बटन दबाते हैं। सही है ना? हम क्या करते हैं स्टार्टिंग के अंदर जब भी ऐप इंस्टॉल करते, सारे चीज़ एक्सेस देते हुए एग्रीड एग्रीड बोल के दबा देते, वो भी हमारा एक कॉन्ट्रैक्ट हो गया कंपनी से। तो ये सारे चीज़ जो है हमें बहुत सी दिक्कत है। तो हम लगातार इस चीज़ के ऊपर जो है कंपनी से लगातार फाइट रखे हुए हैं कि ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट सिस्टम निकाल देना चाहिए, ये चीज़ हट जाना चाहिए इस चीज़ से। तो आज भी हम वही बलबूते पे कि ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट सिस्टम के अंदर जो है बहुत सारा जोल है, ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट सिस्टम के अंदर रिलेशन बिटवीन वर्कर्स और कंपनी का रिश्ता नहीं है। यहाँ तक कि कंपनी को पूरा जिम्मेदारी उठाना है, सोशल सिक्योरिटी बेनिफिट देना है, उनके लिए हेल्थ सेफ्टी देखना है, उनके लिए उनका वर्किंग आवर्स डिफाइन करना है, ये सारे चीज़ देखना है, मगर फिर भी हम जो है वहाँ पे वो कुछ भी नहीं ले रहे, वो कुछ भी नहीं हासिल कर पा रहे। इसकी मेन वजह क्या है बोले तो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट है। वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट जो है, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट सिस्टम जो है पूरा खत्म करके रखा। आप देख सकते फ्री आजकल के जो है गीग इकोनॉमी में, गीग वर्कर्स प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स के इकोनॉमी में जो है, सिर्फ ओला उबर स्विगी जोमेटो ही नहीं है, इसके अंदर आईटी वर्कर्स भी शामिल हो रहे, इस तरीके से जर्नलिस्ट फ्रीलांसर जर्नलिस्ट भी शामिल हो रहे। ये बहुत बड़ा अम्ब्रेला है। ये अम्ब्रेले को अगर जब हम आज के तारीख में यहाँ पे अगर जब रोके नहीं, इसको एक मॉडल में लेके आके एम्प्लॉय का रिलेशनशिप जो है लेबर रिलेशनशिप से नहीं जोड़ेंगे, तो ये बहुत बड़ा जो है अगले आने वाले दिनों में खतरा मोल सकता। तो हम हमारे चीज से पूरी तरीके से बोल रहे कि इसको लेबर के अंदर आना चाहिए, लेबर के एस्पिरेंसी में इसको फाइंड करना चाहिए और लेबर के हिसाब से ही इसको ट्रीट करना चाहिए। कानून भी इसको जो है लेबर के तरीके से ही बनना चाहिए। हम इसी तरीके से जब हमारा प्रॉब्लम फेस हो रहा था, हम लोग ने इंडियन फेडरेशन ऑफ ऐप बेस्ड ट्रांसपोर्ट वर्कर्स के तरफ से हम लोग ने सुप्रीम कोर्ट में भी इस चीज़ को फाइल किया था कि हमारे हक की आवाज़ सुनना चाहिए। ओला उबर स्विगी जोमेटो जैसी कंपनी जो है कहीं पे भी हमारी बात नहीं सुनती। ये कॉन्ट्रैक्ट वर्कर बोल के जो है हमारे सारे गीग वर्कर्स प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स के ऊपर के जितने भी सारे हमारे लेबर रिलेटेड बेनिफिट्स थे, वो सारे बेनिफिट्स को हमारे से छीन लिया गया, क्योंकि हमें वो पार्टनर डिफाइन कर दिए। वो बोलते कि ओला उबर स्विगी जोमेटो डिलीवरी बॉय वाला जो है पार्टनर है, वो पार्टनर बोल के सारे चीज खत्म कर दिए। वो पार्टनर बोलते से वर्ड निकला कहाँ से? कॉन्ट्रैक्ट से निकला। वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट पढ़ा ही नहीं तो बंदा उसको पता क्या चलेगा उस चीज में। तो और आखिरी की तरफ मैं रुख ये करना चाह रहा हूँ कि अगर जब हम ये चीज को नजदीकी से देखें, तो आज के तारीख में जो है ये चीज को हम पहले से भी नहीं मानते हुए आए, आज भी नहीं मानेंगे। कॉन्ट्रैक्ट सिस्टम जो है बहुत ही गलत है, इस चीज़ को हम एक्सेप्ट नहीं करेंगे। मैं आप लोगों से भी ये भी रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूँ, कभी भी आप लोग एक बार पढ़ के देखिए, कभी भी स्विगी जोमेटो ओला उबर के ऐप में कभी भी आप बुक कर रहे, तो कुछ भी चीज़ आप भी दबा के एग्रीड बोल के रखे होंगे, आप भी वो ऑप्शंस को थोड़ा पढ़िए, आपको भी मालूम होता है उसके अंदर की बात क्या है। और आखिरी के खुद में अब जो भी हम लोग अभी तक के जो सुप्रीम कोर्ट का जो केस है हम लोग ने डाला इंडियन फेडरेशन ऑफ ऐप बेस्ड ट्रांसपोर्ट वर्कर्स के तरफ से, उसमें इंदिरा जय सिंह जी एडवोकेट है सुप्रीम कोर्ट में हमारे, उन्होंने बहुत ही अच्छी तरीके से ये सारे चीज़ को, इंडस्ट्रियल एक्ट को भी वहाँ पे जोड़ के रखा और मिनिमम वेज के लिए भी बातचीत करा, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट वर्कर्स को वहाँ से किस तरीके से निकाल देने की बात भी वहाँ पे रखी, हमारे को एम्प्लॉय का ट्रीटमेंट कैसा मिलना चाहिए वो भी चीज़ वहाँ पे है। हमारी लगातार जो है कोशिश ये है कि सरकार से हम ये सारे चीज़ जो है सामने रखें और इस चीज़ को हासिल करें। और मैं ज़्यादा वक्त नहीं लेता चाह रहा हूँ इस चीज़ में, अगर जब कुछ है तो और आगे हमारे एडवोकेट साहब भी बताएंगे। शुक्रिया।
We would like to thank Mr. Shaq Salahuddin for that wonderful speech. Now, I would like to request the first speakers from side opposition, Ms. Rehana Riawala and Ms. Shantaben.
Namaste and a very good evening to the organizers of this debate, all the eminent speakers and the students of the Nalsar University. On behalf of 2.5 million poor workers, women workers from informal economy, we thank Nalsar University for inviting Seva in this debate. Seva, I'll just give a brief on Seva. We are a 2.5 million poor women workers union organized across 18 states of India. And we were organized in 1972. We started in 1972, and today, from the city of Ahmedabad, and today we have our organic spread over 18 states of India. And it's only the last year that we have completed 50 years, and we are looking into even like I'm happy to be here because even at Seva, the second and third generation of the members are coming in, wherein it's also the youth, and our focus is also on youth. And we follow our twin goals of our full employment and self-reliance, the employment that provides income security, employment security, and social security to the informal economy workers, and self-reliance, not just economic self-reliance, but then we see to it that how does the decision-making power of the woman member also increases. And we follow a Gandhian philosophy and ideology. So the values are at the core of Seva. And today we are a confluence of three movements: labor movement, woman movement, and cooperative movement. With this brief introduction, I'm glad that today myself and our leader Shantaban, who herself has worked as a contract labor for several years in the tobacco processing factory, are here to talk about and suggest reforms in the contract law. As we all know that our country is in the process of consolidating all the existing labor laws in 4 labor codes: the Code on Wages 2019, the Industrial Relations Code, the Code on Social Security, and the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Condition Code. And this was done without holding any effective tripartite meetings with the Central Trade Union, and further proceeded to enact the central rules for the implementation of these 4 labor codes. The way the reforms are done currently are supposed to strengthen the capital market and brings more uncertainty and insecurity in the lives of the poor. So the current labor codes, or say the labor law, restricts the trade union activities and collective strength, and thus this reforms needs through a social dialogue between government workers organizations and employers. So it's very important that the tripartite committees, or say the social dialogue between the 3 major sectors, should be taken care. So based on our experiences and representing nation's single largest women union of informal economy, we suggest various reforms that are necessary in the contract labor system and the labor code that covers contract labor system. Also, it is important that we see it in the light of the ILO's report of Global Commission on Future of Work, wherein Seva was also one of the commissioner of 22 commissions coming from various sectors such as economists, academicians, government representatives, civil society, workers representative, that provides basis and recommendation for shaping a dignified and just future of work for the entire workforce of the world, especially the informal workers, the rural workers, and the women workers. This report identifies 3 important pillars: increasing investment in people's capabilities, which calls for lifelong learning, investment in institutions, policies, and strategy to support people through transition associated to changes in the world of work, transformative and measurable agendas for gender equality and universal social protection. Secondly, it's investment in institution of work, which calls upon universal labor guarantee, leveraging time sovereignty, revitalizing the collective representation, and promoting technology that supports decent work and human in command approach. Thirdly, increasing in investment in decent and sustainable work calls for recommendation to promote investment in rural, green, and care economy, and reshaping business incentive structure for the long-term investment in the real economy. So keeping this in mind and talking about the reforms in the labor laws or labor codes, it should be done considering the informal economy, which comprises of 93% of the workforce in our country. And of course, like this is on rise. So it is important to understand the reality of the informal economy. The employment opportunities available in the informal economy is never constant. Due to severe competition, market trends, and changing economic policies, in such situation, informal sector workers often have to pursue more than one trade, especially the rural workers. Their occupations varies depending on what is more conductive at what point of time. In such a scenario, the dignity of such workers is often compromised, and they end up in the vicious downfall of drudgery and poverty. With this, I'll like to invite Shanta Ben to talk about her own experiences in working in the tobacco factory. And then further, Shanta Ben.
My name is Shantaben. I am agriculture worker or tobacco worker. My village through from मेरा आनंद डिस्ट्रिक्ट. मैं आपको सबको कहती हूँ कि मैं एक तंबाकू कामदार बहन हूँ. तंबाकू में काम करती हूँ और तंबाकू की फैक्ट्री में काम करती थी. तो वो देखती हूँ तो मैं करती हूँ तो ऐसा है कि कोई रोजगारी नहीं थी, आपकी आवक नहीं थी, कोई आपका नाम नहीं था, कोई को ओळख नहीं थी. तो बहन की ओळख कामदार है. वो कामदार की ओळख कोई नहीं थी कि सरकार ने कोई आपकी ओळख ना था, वो मालिक को होता, तो मालिक को वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट की बात करते हैं तो मालिक को ऐसा बोलते थे कि आप काम करो और पैसा ले जाओ। वो कैसा पैसा लेने का, क्या लेने का, उसका कोई आपको मालूम नहीं था, क्योंकि आप तो पढ़े लिखे थे नहीं। जैसा काम करा ऐसा काम फैक्ट्री में करते थे। वो इसलिए तो कोई आधार कार्ड नहीं था कि कोई उसका क्या, तो पहचान तो कोई की थी नहीं। तो काम करके जाते थे, आते हैं, पैसा देते थे, इतना लेजर का था। तो बच्चों को पढ़ाने लिखाने का, कि उसके खाना पीना लेने का कोई पैसा कम देते थे, क्या करने का है, कम पैसा, आखा दिन भर काम करते तो कम पैसा देते थे। तो इसलिए सेवाएं संगठन किया, तो संगठन किया तो हमको तो ऐसा पता नहीं संगठन क्या है, तो संगठन में जुड़ी हुई मैं, तो मुझे मालूम है कि संगठन तो श्रमजीवी बहनों के लिए है। क्या काम करते, कोई की पहचान तो है नहीं, मैं कौन हूँ, मेरा नाम शांताबेन है, पर मेरी पहचान किसके है, कोई को नहीं है। तो मालिक जैसे काम कराते थे ऐसा काम करते, जैसा दाम देते थे ऐसा दाम ले जाते थे। तो सेवाएं संगठन किया और त्रिपक्षीय कमेटी बनाई, तो इसमें अंदर सेवा थी और वो मालिक था और सरकार थी और मैं आगेवान थी। तो त्रिपक्षीय कमेटी में सबके साथ में मैं चलती थी और बैठती थी। मैं 200 बहनों के साथ में, इसलिए 200 बहनों के लिए मैं कमेटी में बैठती थी। तो मुझे मालूम हुआ कि कमेटी थी तो सरकार ने वो मिनिमम लघुतम वेतन तो दिया नहीं था, तो लघुतम वेतन के लिए हम सब लोग इसके पास मांग लेते थे कि क्या करने का। तो इंस्पेक्शन करने के लिए हम फैक्ट्री में जाते थे, साहब की सरकार के साथ में जाते थे, तो उसमें तो दो चौपड़ा रखते थे, इसमें अच्छा चौपड़ा रखता था, वो हमके पास सही करा था, ये दिखाता नहीं था, वो मालिक को मालिक उसके पास से अलग लगता था, वो उसके पास था ये चौपड़ा देखा था, तो हमको तो कुछ मालूम नहीं था, हमको सही कर दो तो सही कर दे। बस जब हमें त्रिपक्षीय कमेटी में आई तो मुझे मालूम है, तो आपके लिए तो सब लोग का बहुत परेशान होते हैं न, उसकी रोजी जाती है, इसलिए मैंने बच्ची कमेटी में किया और संगठन सेवाएं बहुत ज़्यादा का संगठन किया और संगठन किया, तो इसलिए मैंने रोजगारी में वधारा किया। तो वधारा किया तो क्या वधारा किया, तो लघुतम वेतन जितना सरकार का था इतना नहीं देते थे, वो 2 चौपड़ा रखता था, तो सरकार आए तो वो चौपड़ा बताते थे और हम पगार देते थे तो दूसरा देते थे। हमको ये तकलीफ थी कि हमारा बच्चों पढ़ाना लिखाना, मैं तंबाकू की फैक्ट्री में काम करती थी, तो इसलिए इसमें बहुत रस उठता था तंबाकू का, तो उसके लिए बीमारी बहुत ज्यादा होती थी, क्षय, टीबी और ऐसी बीमारी, श्वास की बीमारी हो जाती, तो कोई इसका कोई इंश्योरेंस नहीं था, कुछ नहीं था, तो इसलिए जब बहनों के कितनी बहनों, इतनी बड़ी बहनों को ऐसा हुआ तो वो बहन मर जाती थी, उसका बच्चों के गोद में ले जाती थी, तो गोद में लेकर जाती थी तो ऐसा दूध पिलाते थे, तो बच्चों को भी ऐसा होता था बहनों का, तो सेवाएं वो किया, तो संगठन में ऐसा किया, तो वो इंश्योरेंस किया, तो बहनों की तबीयत अच्छी हुई, उसको बच्चों के लिए मालिकों के पास मांग के, सरकार के पास मांग की और झूलाघर किया, तो सुबह बहन उसका बच्चों को सुबह झूलाघर में रख कर जाती थी और आखा दिन भर झूला, ऐसा न था कि आंगनवाड़ी चलती है, ऐसा नहीं था, झूलाघर तो सुबह 8 बजे से सांझे 6 बजे સુધી चलता था, तो बच्चों को झूलाघर में रख कर जाते थे। इसलिए सेवा ने बहुत बड़ा संगठन किया, संगठन के लिए श्रमजीवी बहनों की आमदनी बढ़ी और बच्चों को पढ़ाने लिखाने का हमको ताकत दी, क्योंकि सेवा की ताकत थी, इसलिए हम संगठन की ताकत थी, तो मेरा बच्चों को पढ़ाने लिखाने पैसा नहीं था। तो अगर अभी तो आप देखते हैं कॉन्ट्रैक्ट की बात करते हैं, तो बच्चों पढ़ा लिखा, सब बच्चों पढ़ा लिखा है, पर नौकरी अच्छी के सरकारी नौकरी तो मिलती नहीं कोई को, तो वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में जाते 5 महीने, 6 महीने, वर्ष, 2 महीने महीने 2 महीने रखते हैं और तो छोड़ देते हैं, तो वो इसका जीवन कैसा होता है? वो कुत्ते के जैसा हो, वो कुत्ता यहाँ जाए, कहाँ से रोटी मिले ये खाए, वो रख जाए, ऐसा होता। तो मैंने तो ऐसा नहीं करने के लिए सरकार के साथ में आपके सबको कहती हूँ कि सबको सरखी आमदनी मिले, सबको। अभी तो देखते हैं तो वो स्थानिक लोग को स्थलांतर लोग को आकर काम करते हैं, एमने जितना पैसा देता है इतना ले जाते हैं, वो काम करते हैं। तो जो श्रमजीवी बहन है, जो स्थानिक बहन हो, उसको रोजी नहीं मिलती। तो सबको रोजी मिले, सरखी रोजी मिले, इसलिए मैं आपको सबको कहती हूँ कि सबको एक सरखी रोजी मिले, तो इसको बच्चों को पढ़ाए लिखाए। मैंने अभी तो मेरी बात करती हूँ तो मैं तो बहुत समझी थी, मैं सेवा में जुड़ी हुई, तो सेवा क्या संगठन की मेरा में ताकत है, तो मालिक आपको तो बोलने नहीं देते थे, वो बैठने नहीं देते। तो अभी तो मुझे इतनी ताकत सेवा से लिया है, तो मैं बोल सकती हूँ, मालिक के सामने बोल सकती हूँ, वो सरकार के सामने भी बोल सकती हूँ। मैं इतनी वो सेवा में ताकत है, तो मैं डेप्यूटी सरपंच में चुना कर आ गई। मेरा गांव में 26,000 की बस्ती में मैं डेप्यूटी सरपंच में चुना कर आ गए, और मेरे बच्चों को मेरे पास कुछ नहीं था, पर सेवा का संगठन में मैं जुड़ी हूँ। तो मैं मेरा दोनों बच्चों, आप सब लोग बैठे हैं तो मैं सबको मैं मेरा नमस्कार करता हूँ। मेरा दोनों बच्चों को, मेरा 2 बेटा को मैं एडवोकेट बनाया, और अभी मेरा दोनों बेटा एडवोकेट है। तो आप सबको मैं नमस्कार करता, तो आप सब एडवोकेट बनो और सब कानून का रास्ते में चलो। सबको नमस्कार।
So what Shantavan tried to say was all about the organizing strength, and like what she talked about was there was a when she was working in a factory, there was different to register. One was say with reference to, though the minimum wages were 70 rupees at that time, but then they were getting only 20 rupees, and they have to sign 2 registers. There was a different register for the labor inspector where when he comes, and there was a different register from which the payroll was being done. And so like Seva organized them, we worked with them and organized the worker education classes, and they understand what are their about their identity, their roles, their and then like then based on that, the tripartite committees were formed, and through the tripartite committee, we were able to negotiate with the factory owners as well for the childcare crashes, like the daycare center. It was not like an ICDS, but then it used to run as a like based on the workers' schedule of work. And so it run from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock, so that their children are taken care. They are not exposed to the like the hazardous situation or the condition in the tobacco factory and so on. And even the elder generation, the elder children also would get an education because of this. And then we also worked on health and insurance related aspects. So this is how we took inspections with the labor department, and this is how the reforms took place. For the informal economy, the first and foremost thing what we say, it's the organizing strength which would bring forward. And then other thing which came out of Santaban's talk is also that the universal labor guarantee and the adequate living income, it should be equal for all states. Norms for fixation should be spelled out. It is important as currently many of the workers are working as bonded laborers. So this is one of the reform, the adequate living income, because for the informal workers, like they are most of the time they are self-employed, or at least they have contractual or subcontractual arrangements, and so there is no employer-employee relationship, and then hence many of the times for the informal economy workers, wages do not come into the picture. And so what we are advocating is for the adequate living income. And also when we talk about reduction in the number of working hours in the code or the law, for the self-employed workers, if the productivity increases, the workers get fair prices for their produce. Only then the workers is not compelled to work for long hours. And therefore piece rate becomes important here, because the income of most of the self employed is based on piece rate. Therefore, if the piece rate doesn't increase according to the rate of inflation, then informal sector will have to continue working for long hours. And in reality, the global value chain not only involve piece rate, but also contracts and gender. So how do we ensure adequate piece rate reaches the actual producer, who is generally the home-based worker at the bottom of the value chain? Despite the presence multiple levels of contractors and subcontractors, this piece rate and contract subcontract system also has a direct implication of gender and homework, and thus it is important to consider reforms around this. Furthermore, there is a need to focus on investing on capacity building of the rural and informal workers to not only help them reskill and upskill, but also acquire new skills to enable smooth transition of these workers to the newer forms of work that are currently being generated and will be generated in future. For this, the recommendation of lifelong learning and suggestions to funding such lifelong learning needs to be implemented. Another thing reform which we would see is for the small and marginal farmers. It is becoming more and more unstable and unviable due to the effects of the climate change. Therefore, to ensure decent and sustainable work, it is important to promote the rural and green economy through increased investment in rural and green economy. Another thing which we need to be looked into is incentivize the companies to invest in labor augmenting technology, as this will accelerate the stagnant and structural transformation and enabling shifting of high productivity and formalizing the informal workers. Most of the women workers in the informal sector, who are generally the poorest of the poor, their tolls are old and worn out, and these women hardly have any information about or access to direct market, and thus in an organized manner the collective bargaining power would be increased, while organized they could be part of the mainstream economy. And so it is important that the formation, strengthening and scaling up of these workers own and manage tiny and micro enterprises should be included, and just not included, but an enabling framework that allows them to scale should also be built there to build their robust value chains and supply chains. And like as Shantaben talked about, the another important aspect is social dialogue. And the decision regarding the lives of the informal workers should be done through the approach should be human-centered, and the social dialogue should be included in whatever reforms of labor laws and labor codes are being done. And this would lead to say the security, the social security, and the work security of the informal economy workers. Because for the informal economy workers, work security and social securities are two sides of the same coin, especially in the current scenario when the formal sector itself is shrinking while implementing the universal social protection. It is important that the definition of the social security is broadened so that it applies to all the sectors of the workforce. So, and lastly, I would like to emphasize that the role of, it's also that in the current labor code, the role of inspector is also diluted by the inspector cum facilitator. So this is also like there's a need for disputed resolution systems as well. So these are the certain labor reforms in the labor laws or the codes which we, considering the informal economy workers at the center, would like to submit. Thank you.
I would like to thank Ms. Rehana and Ms. Shantaben for the wonderful speech. Now, from the side government, for the second speaker, I would like to request Mr. Sudarshan Rao to share his thoughts.
At the outset, I would like to thank Nalsar for inviting me here. And I also come to know that you people are pursuing the cause of contract workers in this university. I really appreciate you and मेरा सलाम आप सब लोगों को. I know you're all highly motivated, very committed students. And apart from pursuing your studies, you're also thinking about the poor workers. इस मसले पे मुझे एक निडा फजली साहब का गजल में से 2 लाइन याद आ रहे, मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा आपका काम देख के. धूप में निकलो, घटाओं में नहा कर देखो. धूप में निकलो, घटाओं में नहा कर देखो. जिंदगी क्या है, किताबों को हटा कर देखो. आपने गजल के 2 जो अशार है उसको आप सच में साबित करके दिखाया. दोबारा एक बार सलाम करता हूं आपको. I spent my 45 years in the labor movement, and it is very disheartening to experience that the contract labor system, which has been in vogue right from the British period, you can check the Whiteley Commission, 1929, when the Britishers were ruling. They appointed a Whiteley Commission, and Whiteley Commission said that contract labor, bonded labor has to be abolished. And after the independence, in the year 1970, the Government of India has formulated the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act 1970. The context at that time was, in the second 5-year plan, it was envisaged that the public sector should be established and there should be rapid industrialization on the Soviet model. And in the fourth 5-year plan, that is 1969 to 74, India has embarked upon the concept of self-reliance. So, state capitalism, import substitution, self-reliance, bank nationalization, land reforms, these are some of the objectives of the fourth 5-year plan. So, when the Act was formulated, the main objective of the Act was abolition of contract labor. I'll just, the first 2 lines of the aims and objectives of the Act, I would like to bring to your notice. An Act to regulate the employment of contract labor in certain establishments and to provide for its abolition in certain establishments and for matters connected therewith. Right from 1970 till 2023, in this long 53 years of the Act is implemented more in breach than in practice, than in compliance. The best example is Nalsar. It's a sham contract. How do you define what is a perennial nature of duties and what are intermittent seasonal nature of duties? The Industrial Disputes Act very clearly says that any intermittent nature of work should be less than 120 years in a preceding year. You can please go through the Act. It's a very progressive piece of legislation, but it was not implemented. So, when it is more than 120 days in a preceding year, it is not intermittent. If you call it seasonal employment, if it is more than 60 days in a year, it is not seasonal. Take, for example, your own case. The workers working here, they work in all shifts around the year, and still you call them contract workers. So it's a sham contract. The 53 years of India's independence has shown that contract labor, in spite of the Act, it is not regulated, it is neither abolished. On the contrary, it has increased a million times it has increased. One example is all government sectors, all government departments, all public sector establishments, the ratio, the proportion of contract workers to the proportion of regular workers is 75-80 to 20-25%. 75 to 80% of the contract workers are contract workers. Only 20 to 25 are regular workers. And you know what are the wage differentials? Wage differentials is a contract labor on an average gets 1/3 of the wages that is given to the regular workers. Do we call this humanity? 54 crore people are the working people in this country. As my sister has said, if you take out the 7%, 50 crore people are in the 93% segment of the working class. The government makes 4 labor codes in the parliament by a voice vote. You all know what is a voice vote. Just raise your hands. Whoever are present there, just raise your hands. There was no discussion, no select committee. None of the trade unions were consulted in this matter. And still we call ourselves the largest democracy of the world. 40% of the people have no voice. They have no rights. कोई अस्तित्व नहीं है उनका, कोई जबान नहीं है उनका. बिना जबान, बिना अस्तित्व, बिना पहचान के जीते ये लोग, 50 करोड़ लोग. And we call it दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा जमहूरियत है. I say contract labor is unconstitutional. Article 19(1)(c) of the Constitution says you have freedom of association. You can form associations. And associations include trade unions. Second thing, Article 21, right to life. Then Article 14. You see that all these 3 articles of the Constitution, which are the fundamental rights of the Constitution, they are denied to contract workers. And the change of context has made a huge difference. Now we don't have the justices like Justice Chinnappa Reddy or Justice Krishna Iyer or Justice P.B. Sawant. We don't have people like that. Now you see, after 1991, the judiciary has also changed its attitude towards the labor. 240 days will constitute you for a regular service. Regular service doesn't mean they should be automatically made permanent. But the services are regular. They are not intermittent, they are not seasonal. Nothing is recognized. The heart and soul of the Contract Labor Regulation Abolition Act is Section 10 of the Constitution. Section 10 of the Constitution says that wherever there is perennial nature of duties, there are 4 conditionalities I would like to bring to your notice. If the work is perennial and must go on from day to day, number 1. Number 2, incidental and necessary for the work of the factory, number 2. Number 3, sufficient to employ a considerable number of whole-time workers. And 4, being done in most concerns through regular workmen. I'll take, for example, your own case, the contract workers in Nalsar. They meet all the 4 conditionalities here, but still they are contract workers. So, as I said before, the act is implemented more in breach than in compliance. Why this is happening? The biggest reason is, when the act was formulated by Mrs. Gandhi in 1970, kindly also refer to the Indian Patents Act of 1970. The Indian Patents Act of 1970 stressed more about the product patent rather than process patent. But after that, under the IMF and World Bank conditionalities, we have altered our Indian Patent Act. We have also changed our Indian Monopolies and Restrictions MRTP Act. We have changed everything under the conditionalities of IMF and World Bank. You all know that in late 1980s, we had a serious balance of payments crisis. To tide over the balance of payments crisis, Chandrasekhar has pledged gold. I think most of you are not born at that time, but still I'm saying. So we pledged the gold, but that was a better option, going for IMF World Bank loans. So under these conditionalities, the welfare nature of the Constitution has completely changed. The Constitution remains the same, but the focus is different. So what has happened is, in these 53 years of the Act, Section 10, which says that wherever the appropriate government, either the central government or the state government, wherever the appropriate government says that the work of these contract workers is neither intermittent nor seasonal, then they should be regularized. And Air India statutory case in Supreme Court They said for automatic absorption of contract labor once the contract has been proved as sham. But the later judgments which came, they said, no, there is no automatic regularization. It has to go through a process. The moment they lose the case, workers are removed from the roles of the service. And you know, freedom of association, I fought in these 45 years. Wherever we form a union, the first thing is you have to fight the local mafias, local gundans se ladna padta. You have to fight the political parties. You have to fight the employers. You have to fight the governments. When I was active in the trade union movement in the 80s, 90s, I had criminal cases in all the 4 districts. At that time, it was Andhra Pradesh. I had cases in Nalgonda, Mehboob Nagar, Rangareddy, and Medak. In all these districts, every time I had cases. Why? Because wherever you try to form a union, the moment you form a union, it is busted. So where is the question of contract workers trying to exercise the rights given under the Constitution? We are not asking anything extra. Just implement the act. Now, that act has become irrelevant. It has become redundant. That has no significance at all because government believes in ease of doing business. Government doesn't believe in ease of living life. Life doesn't matter. Business matters. All 5-year plans are gone. We have नीति आयोग. अब राजनीति में नीति कितना है आप जानते हैं. मैं कुछ बोलना नहीं चाहता. There is no नीति in the नीति आयोग commission. So ultimately what is happening is the governments, the corporates, the media, they speak the same language. Language is the same. All the 3 speak the same language. And this democracy is of the corporates, by the corporates, and for the corporates. This is the reality of India today. And we are passing through the most authoritarian regime. I have seen emergency 1975, 26 June 1975 emergency. It went on for 18 months. We all survived the emergency. But that emergency is 1 lakh times better than the present emergency. This is an undeclared emergency. We are passing through the worst. So, workers don't have any right. The day before yesterday in Hyderabad Central University, the whole students, teachers, and the non-teaching staff, I'm the president of the union. We have made a big demonstration against the administration because people who have been working for 26 years, 15 years, 18 years, they have been summarily removed from service, saying that you're not required, you're disengaged. What is this? एक मारवाड़ी दुकान हमारे सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट, स्टेट गवर्नमेंट, ऑटोनमस बॉडी से बेहतर है. This is the state of affairs. So therefore, I don't know how much time I have. I have 3, 4, 5 minutes. Okay, thank you so much. So what we are seeing is we don't see a cooperative federalism. What we see is a competitive federalism. Competition is not between India and China. Competition is between Bangalore, Karnataka and Telangana. Competition between Andhra and Telangana. Competition between Gujarat and Delhi. Who is going to offer more shops to the investors? So to attract investments, what you are doing is you are creating a union-free environment. You are all law students, kindly check the Special Economic Zones Act. It will be funny to observe in that act. One state says 50% of the workers in SEZs can be members of union. One state says 25% of the workers can be part of the union. Why? Because labor is on the concurrent list. So both center and state they adjudicate upon. So states make their own rules. So this is the situation. The 4 labor codes. The 4 labor codes are nothing but the royal pathway of making the workers modern slaves. The conditions of modern slavery are existing. You see for example, the software industry. You know, whenever there are redundancies, they use bouncers. हम सोचते थे खाली बाउंसर्स को मारुति सुजुकी में इस्तेमाल किए, बाउंसर्स यहाँ भी इस्तेमाल होते. If you don't resign, you are made to resign by the bouncers, and that is the kind of industrial democracy we are living in. So under this competitive federalism, federal states are competing amongst themselves, between themselves, and the race is going to the bottom. The wages are coming down. The working conditions are coming down. They are just living like robots. They have no emotions, no rights, nothing. The moment you open your mouth, you are removed from service. And most disturbing was, once I saw an appointment order in the software industry. It says you cannot be a member of the union. One of the conditions of the contract, because every employment is a contract, you have to sign the contract. So I asked the Additional Commissioner of Labor, this is unconstitutional against 19(1)(c) of the Constitution. How the hell can he write this? He says, we have been told by KTR, the Honorable KTR, that with lot of difficulty we are asking companies to come and invest here, we cannot have unions. So what is the difference between a corporate, whether it is a national or a multinational, and the government? So now workers don't have anybody. They have to fend only for themselves. So therefore, I will not take much time. The Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, which was promulgated with lofty ideals, lofty objectives, it has failed to deliver. Therefore, these 53 years have proved, these 5 decades have proved that contract labor cannot be regulated. It cannot be regulated. Therefore, it has to be abolished. There is no option second to that. It is inhuman, it is unconstitutional, and against human rights. Labor rights are human rights. Denying labor rights is denying human rights. India is a signatory to the World Declaration of Human Rights. India is a signatory, is a founder member of the International Labour Organization. And ILO says that labor is not a commodity. The ILO Convention 1964 Philadelphia Convention says labor is not a commodity. And the first ILO Convention of 1919 is 8 hours work. And you see any of the shopping malls, you see the security guards of your campus, they all work for 12 hours. Where is that? Where are the labor rights? So I appeal to you, the contract labor system should be summarily dismissed. It should be dismantled, lock, stock and barrel, and it should be abolished. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Mr. Sudarshan Rao for providing the legal perspective on this angle. Now, I would request Ms. Nandini Sarkar, who is going to speak from an employer's perspective.
Choosing the power. Somebody can just navigate the slides for me. So, very good evening, everyone. I was sharing with the reception committee that the only reason why Shushoban and I are from Sequel, a company which has been working at the grassroots level, at the corporate level, very uniquely positioned that we are in our own rights an employer, hiring contract labor. We are also ourselves contractors deploying manpower and services at different corporates. And uniquely, we are also auditors where corporates engage us to conduct audits on contractor compliance, because any decent corporate today is not only under a legal mandate, but also a corporate governance mandate to ensure that contractors comply. So, today what we wanted to present to you is our view of working in more than 91 cities pan-India for the last 2 decades as an employer, as a contractor ourselves, and as a contract labor auditor. So with this introduction, let me first show you the case for deploying contract labor as we have understood it. So we'll go to slide 2. So, I wanted to share with you that we saw during COVID when work from home and digital solutions became the norm.
we ourselves at SQL got a lot of projects, for online delivery of our services. At that time, we were not able to recruit people from the IT. My recruitment team gave up saying that we are unable to find people, the demand is so high. So what would our option be? To just give up on job delivery, or to actually go out and contract the demand that we had for IT services to other contractors. So today, as part of COVID, there's another phenomena which was widely reported. It was not an India phenomena, it was a global phenomena, which was called the Great Resignation Debate, that people just quitting jobs and employers not finding talent. I wanted to share with you, while I have huge respect for the work that the Gig Workers Association of India is doing, I want to share my direct experience of working with our client Swiggy. Swiggy told me, so they were under notice from the Provident Fund organization to give Provident Fund benefits to all their Swiggy gig workers. And they told me that they've actually carved out the budget. They're just waiting for the Employees Provident Fund organization to make this an enactment. I also want to share my direct experience that during COVID, when Swiggy found that thousands of manpower was going back to the villages and not wanting to stay on as delivery boys in the city, they consulted SQL on what package to create for the workers that wanted to go back and couldn't continue the service. One of the recommendations that SQL made was to extend medical coverage, even though people were quitting the Swiggy jobs and going back to the villages. And I'm very happy to share with you that Swiggy implemented. So today, the gap that I've been hearing speakers from the opposition talk about is not a gap in the government intent. It is certainly not a gap in the law. Having worked, for organizations outside India, notably Bangladesh, where there is actually no concept of social security. I was telling members of the reception committee that in Bangladesh, Provident Fund compliance is an option. It's not mandatory like in India. I also want to show you in the course of my presentation the number of measures that the government is taking to bring all 40 crore unorganized sector workers under the umbrella of social security. Why the government is not succeeding at the pace that it wants to is because the type of enforcement mechanisms that it has set up definitely needs reform. So, the case for contract labor deployment is so great that today, not only, I was reading some figures in the National Law Review, and this is as recent as March 23. We'll move on to the next slide. The March 23 National Labor Review states that there has been, a quantum leap in contract labor deployment in India, and figures suggest that in 2015-16, it jumped to an all-time high of 28%, and the figures predict that contractual employment is actually going to be more than 53%. So keep in mind, another thing that, we'd like to demystify is when people speak about contract labor, they are mixing up different sectors. So let's be very clear that, what is this contract labor workforce that we are speaking about? There is an organized sector, there is an unorganized sector. So in the organized sector, there is a clear mandate on the principal employer that every contract labor must have an appointment letter. Every contract labor must be covered under PF, ESI, and other social security benefits such as gratuity and leave encashment. So the question is not that the law doesn't exist, and the question is not that there is no enforcement. I'll give you the figures. I mentioned to you that SQL also conducts contract labor audits for corporates all over the country in more than 90 cities. Last month, we audited more than 3,000 different contractual agencies all over the country. And all these, contract labor audits are being sanctioned or mandated by the principal employer. The principal employer is paying for not only the minimum wages, but also the gratuity, the bonus, the leave encashment. So, when we approach or when we talk about Nalsar not doing its bit for the contract workers, the fault is with Nalsar management. The fault is not with the law. The fault is not with the government. So if you ask me what is the reform or what is the next level of activism that, the Nalsar Students Union, which has taken up this cause, should do, they should bring on the EPF authorities, the ESI authorities, and tell them that, look, this is where the benefits are falling short. This is the mandate. So why don't you stitch it together? I'll also share with you that in West Bengal, we are headquartered in Calcutta, West Bengal. I have seen somebody was mentioning the IT sector, just asking people, throwing people out with bouncers. But my experience has been very different in West Bengal itself. Industrial disputes IT workers, if they are terminated on performance grounds with the full and final settlements being paid, but still they raise a dispute, the Labor Department doesn't hesitate to summon the employer and ask the question. So today, in our opinion, the gap is not that there is no law and there is no intent to comply and there is an intent to exploit. I want to show you through a series of slides the measures that the government has implemented to make contract labor deployment actually work in favor of the contractors while giving them the freedom and the liberty to choose how they work. So, because you're law students, I thought that we look at the judicial perspective, then we would look at the legal perspective, what sort of laws, and we look at the enforcement. So, there are two judgments that I picked up to discuss with you. One is the landmark Supreme Court judgment in the case of the Standard Vacuum Cleaning Company, where the court held that even though the nature of work being done by the contract workers was perennial in nature, however, the contract itself was genuine. Hence, the court held that there was no need to regularize the contract workers because the contract was genuine. Now, we can always argue that the people in management who are responsible to enforce that contractors get minimum wages, they get their bonus, they get their leave encashment, get their gratuity, they are not doing their job of audit. But my testimony to all of you as people, as a company that audits thousands of contractors through hundreds of companies is very, very different. And why the principal employer? And today, I don't know if you all know, the government itself has introduced a portal. It's called the GEM portal. Any PSU contract today can only happen through an online GEM portal bidding. And the first thing that any contractor has to upload on the GEM portal is his PF registration, his ESI registration, a certificate that, his minimum wages compliant. So, what are we talking about when we say that the government doesn't have an intent or there is no intent in this country to protect? Also, given the huge suffering that migrant labor went through during COVID, the government has also introduced the eShram portal. So the intent of the eShram portal, which has already seen more than 6 crore registrations, is that those workers who are not covered under PF and ESI get covered under the eShram benefit, and the government, using its corpus under the BOCW and under the LWF funds, plans to get workers to get the PF and ESI benefits. So we'll move on to the other judicial verdict. In the second verdict, it was held, this is a recent case with SAIL, where it says that just because a certain contract work has been abolished by an order of the appropriate authority, doesn't mean that the contract labor has to be regularized going forward. So this is the judicial view. Now we'll move on and we'll come to the government view. So, this was a statement given in the Lok Sabha by the MOS Food, who made a statement regarding one of the biggest PSUs in the country, the Food Corporation of India, which also hires lakhs of contract workers. So the minister stated that we have a digital payment system for these contractual labor, which has been part of a union negotiated settlement, and we are paying according to that. We monitor according to that. And then he went on to say, if you see the history of compliance with these contract workers, it is completely as per agreement. And he went on to conclude that because we are ensuring that contract labor get their benefits as per a union agreed settlement, and this is being monitored, we see no reason to discontinue these services in FCI. Moving on. So that's the government intent, that, it's a market reality. And I mentioned to you that for most employers, it's a reason for business continuity, that there is a talent crunch, there is a crunch. And another interesting thing, the National Labor Review, March 23, stated very interestingly that, the maximum demand for contract labor was coming from the IT sector, because the IT sector is not able to recruit. Recently, there's one experience that SQL also had in Mumbai. We hired a boy from Swiggy. He told us that he was in the Thane area, and we told him that our area of work would be in Bandra in Mumbai. And he worked with us for 2 months, and then he said, I want to quit. I know you're trying to teach me audit, you're trying to teach me how to be an executive, but I would rather prefer doing my Swiggy work in Thane. My own direct experience, I'm a big user, big end user of, say, the Urban Company app. And I especially take their beautician and their massage services. I have interviewed all the young girls that, come to my home to deliver, at-home services. without fail, all of them have told me that because of these services that are being rendered by a Swiggy, by an urban company, lakhs of youth are getting work. So I was asking her, that as a beautician, what is the minimum or what is the average earning per month that you have? And she told me that, I earn at least 20,000 a month during normal months, and during puja, that could go up to 40,000 rupees also. And she also went on to say that I support my father in the renovation. So we are renovating our house and my father is getting my support in renovating our house. I'm actually able to pay for it. And that's, Shanta Ben's testimony also. She said earlier I was working in a tobacco factory. I had, long hours and it was very harmful for my health. But with Seva, I have the opportunity to work as a freelancer, work as part of a cooperative team, and still, earn a decent livelihood. So again, the question is not that, contract labor should be abolished. It is a business reality. It's a reality where business continuity has to be ensured because, at the end of the day, a manpower supplier. So basically, there are two categories of contractual engagements. One could be a pure manpower supplier. The other is, providing specialized services. For instance, our company Sequel is a contractor to many Mahanavratan PSUs and many corporates in the areas of HR, employee benefit management, employee contract labor welfare management. So those are specialized services which their own HR is not able to deliver, which is why they are relying on a contractual engagement with Sequel to render those services, which we have been doing pan-India in more than 91 cities for the last 21 years. And, we are working even in remote locations in Jorhat. So the whole intent is how to audit and ensure that the compliance happens. So talking about the reforms since 2014, and we've been in this domain since 2001. Since 2014, labor reforms have been coming fast and furious. So, I hear a lot of people saying that the labor codes have not been implemented, it's run into disputes. I want to share our direct experience that, they are being silently implemented from behind the scenes. The government is using the EPF and the ESI as its vehicle. I'll give you one example. Before that, let me tell you, these reforms have taken three forms. One is that the existing amendments to existing labor codes, we'll just move back. The other is digital delivery of services and digitization of labor records. Let me give you one example concerning contract labor in each of these. So the existing labor law was amended to include subcontractors also as part of the contractual engagement. So, in a lot of setups, we find that the person taking on the contract is also deploying a lot of subcontractors. Now, the law mandates that even the subcontractors' compliance responsibility under labor laws rests solely with the principal employer. Now, digital delivery. So, we handle a lot of project sites, which have, say, a railway site, a metro rail site. The government has launched, the EPF has launched an app called the Umang app, through which any contractor without the employer's signature can get his provident fund transferred, can take a loan. No employer intervention is required. Our company has worked at those sites, conducting camps and training the workers how to use the app. So Shushoban here, who's with me from Sequel, found in Sri Perembadur that there are more than 50,000 contract workers. Employers like Motorola are paying for their ESI, but the contract workers are not able to access the ESI. So instead of, agitating against anybody, he just took up the matter with the insurance commissioner in Delhi. And the insurance commissioner gladly deployed a team in Sri Perembadur, Tamil Nadu, where 50,000 contract workers were covered under ESI, given free medical checkup and given a smart card. So, what we lack in this country is there aren't enough people telling the government that, look, this is what you need to fix. The laws are in place, the intent is in place. Sometimes the enforcement is not happening in a suitable manner, but that needs to be escalated to the government through appropriate forums. For instance, during COVID itself, the Union Labour Ministry invited us to various consultative committee meetings, and many of our suggestions have been implemented, including the work done by Shushoban here on EDLI. So it's a scheme. Earlier, when a private sector worker used to die, the family used to get 40 to 50,000 as death insurance. because of the work that SQL did for 3 years in doing the calculations and showing the government that they were sitting on a corpus of 15,000 crores under EDLI, whereas the dispensation on death was only a paltry 40 to 50,000 rupees, led the government to improve the EDLI scheme. Today, I'm very happy to share with you that when a worker dies in service, the minimum guaranteed death insurance under EPF is 2.5 lakhs and the maximum could be 7 lakhs, no questions asked. So today, I'm very happy to think that, 8 crore live EPF members are assured that if somebody dies in service, they are assured of this minimum guaranteed amount under EDLI. So we'll move on. So as part of the amendment, fixed term employment is already legal in India. And if you read the notification, the fixed term employment says, if you're hiring somebody for a fixed term, even the gratuity has to be paid proportionately. If somebody undergoes a maternity during that time, even the maternity benefit has to be paid. Today, SQL's experience of working with different corporates is, when they decide to hire fixed term executive workers, they ask us what is the package that should be given. And when we tell them that proportionate gratuity, proportionate leave encashment has to be given, I'm very happy to share with you that they comply. Next. Also, for the first time, the new labor codes have sort of made contract labor deployment legitimate. For the first time in Indian labor law lexicon, the word manpower supply figures in the definition of contract labor. Interestingly, it also goes on to state that the worker of a contractor who has an appointment letter and is covered for social security benefits shall not be treated as a contractor. So, the writing on the wall is very clear that any worker who has signed up with a contractor through an appointment letter is covered under PF and ESI is not to be treated and not to be defined as a contract labor because of the rights are in place. Then what is missing? The enforcement. The enforcement that, in our direct experience of handling so many corporates, Indian and MNCs, is actually happening because the penalties for non-compliance under EPF, ESI labor is huge. Today, a labor department can prosecute an Airtel in Gurgaon just because the contract labor registers are not being updated every month. So it's not that the intent is not there. And employers have woken up to this fact. Even major PSUs have had to pay crores in fines because of ESI non-compliance. And as a result of that, they have ensured, A, that no tendering by a contractor will be successful unless he has a PF ESI registration. B, PSUs like Indian Oil have engaged SQL. So every month, no. Okay. Yeah. So, whether it's an Indian Oil Corporation at Haldia, more than 13,000 workers are working, contract workers. Every month, SQL is auditing those 13,000 workers. We are checking the bank evidence to see whether the minimum wages, the salary as agreed and negotiated are being paid. So not only at Indian Oil, recently at Numaligarh, the government has commissioned a big refining project where more than 350 different agencies are deploying thousands of workers. So SQL's job there is right from the time of payroll generation, right from the time of background verification, right from the time of monthly PF ESI bonus, SQL has to audit. Only then the bills are going to get settled. So our direct experience at SQL is all over the country where we are giving these services to corporates. Corporates are not releasing contracted bills unless the compliance is done. And we have also worked with, very reputed educational institutions in West Bengal. I don't want to name them, but in West Bengal, the country's, top reputed institutions have been serviced by SQL in contract labor compliance, and this has been ensured month on month. Yeah, we'll move on. So, I'll quickly show you how the contract labor compliance audit is done. I thought it would be an interesting learning for all of you. So, the government's compliance agenda has been published on every labor department website, central and state, you'll find a menu. It's called inspection checklist and ease of doing business. Under ease of doing business and inspection checklist, the major agenda that government has called out to principal employers includes minimum wages, provident fund, ESI, licensing activities, and full and final settlement. In all the states today, now there is a single window system. So any company wanting to get into any business activity is now required also to do. There's a huge change that we've seen post-COVID, that no company can carry on its construction activities or other installation or engineering related activities unless a contract labor license, a BOCW license, and an interstate migrant labor license are in place. And all of this, helps the government to enforce. You will see even in Delhi, the Delhi government has made it a mandate that every principal employer having contractors has to ensure that the contractor monthly uploads his compliance documents, including evidence of payment to contractors. Without that, the contract labor license will not get registered. So, with all these measures, whether it is the judicial view of contract labor engagement being legitimate, whether it is the testimony of people like Shanta Ben, or my own experience of urban company associates or Amazon gig workers who say this gives us much needed independence, whether from a sheer business continuity and talent crunch perspective, contract labor is here to stay. A McKinsey report says that worldwide, the contract labor deployment has already crossed 36%, and it is expected to reach more than 53% worldwide. So, it's something that is there. It is something which is being supported beautifully through wonderful legislation, through government intent. And what is not working is basically, the same seriousness that the government gave to GST implementation. If the government gives this seriousness to the Labor Department, to better IT, so this is likely to improve. Now, finally, before concluding, I'd like to say that the contract labor is divided into two parts, organized and unorganized. The organized sector contractors are already registered companies with their own PF ESI numbers, and they are doing that compliance once the principal employer is enforcing that and linking that to their bills. A weak area today is definitely the agricultural sector, which the government has not yet covered. So, I was telling Akhil this afternoon that, Akhil, the kind of advocacy that you're doing at Nalsar, why don't you also write to the Prime Minister's Man Ki Baat program and ask to be heard by the Prime Minister that, sir, we appreciate what you're doing for the organized sector contractor compliance, but why don't you bring in the 24 crore workers in the agricultural sector? And I clearly see a weakness in construction sites where migrant labor is deployed. So, we also do a lot of work with companies like Alstom and Bombardier that are running major metro rail projects. They hire registered contractors who have PF-ESI numbers, and we audit to ensure that all the contract labor get their monthly salary on time in their bank accounts and the PF and ESI. But the migrant contract workers need better coordination from the government in terms of identifying them through an Aadhaar enrollment and then ensuring that the actual beneficiary gets the money. So with this, once again, I'd like to thank the student committee of the student bar debate for coming up with a topic which we never thought. I think all of us here never thought that, a young student community would be interested in this topic. But Shobhan and I were discussing, and that's the reason we came down from Calcutta, that if the brightest law students in this country are interested in this topic and advocating it, so it's a very, very good sign for India shining. So please do take up with the Prime Minister's office on the Man Ki Baat program that what you're doing for organized sector contract labor, the same speed and the same intent that you showed for a GST compliance, that also needs to come into the agricultural sector and the construction sector. So thank you and wish you all the very best.
I would like to thank Ms. Nandini Sakar for her views. And now I would like to request Devashi Paul from site government. I would like now request Amisha Rayamaji from site government as a student speaker from the government side.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you look closely enough at my hand, you'll notice that I have a band-aid wrapped around my finger. I got a paper cut while preparing for this debate yesterday, so I have a band-aid on. But if I had a cancerous tumor instead, or a deadly infectious disease like our very own coronavirus, fixing a band-aid would not solve the problem. Sometimes the problem is so enormous and malignant that there are never simple quick fix solutions to it, like either fixing a band-aid or reforming the laws. Slavery as an institution was abolished. No one was advocating to make slavery legal as a 9-to-5 job. Of course, some of us are bound and doomed to it in our future in corporate law firms. Sati, for example, no one was advocating it to be made legal for women who are above 20 years of age. Some things, like contract labor system, are fundamentally evil, so it needs to be nipped at the bud, abolish contract labor, regularize them as employees, train them, and absorb them. First, contract labor system is the modern day capitalist and casteist exploitation that exists in the society. Mr. Rao also said in his speech that the rise of contract labor system as an industry, especially in the global south, is directly linked to the rise of private industries, corporate houses, and MNCs. In India, for example, it came after the 5-year policies or the 90s LPG policies, right? That essentially meant that companies were either circumventing the existing labor law regimes to opt into beneficial contract that would just make their operations cheaper, or laws simply couldn't catch up. Case in point, the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, or the CLRA. So why contract labor? Why do these companies opt into contract labor to begin with? First, because they are extremely cheap. Contract laborers earn 33% of the wage of regularized employees, or in the words of Mr. Rao, 1/3 of the entire wage that a regularized employee earns. The minimum wage standard, as has been discussed so far, might exist on paper, but there's no implementation or enforcement of these standards. So that essentially means that they don't earn the minimum wage that they're entitled to. After all, these contract laborers are literally former slaves and serfs. Why even pay them to begin with, right? That's the mindset of the employers. Second, you don't know who to hold accountable in a contract labor system. The idea is that there's no direct relationship between a principal employer and a contract labor. You do it through a third-party intermediary who hires and supervises and pays the worker. So that essentially means that when there's a case of violation, like Madam Nandini was saying that, well, it's the principal employer's job to pay the PFs and minimum wages. But in case of violation, there are fingers that are being pointed at each other. It's a very confusing system where you can't hold a person accountable and can't hold a person liable. Therefore, the whole process of accountability is extremely confusing. Third, there is no job security in a contract labor system. You can, as a poor individual, be hired and fired at any point in time. You're treated as a literal disposable individual. There's low rate of unionization, and there are no social security nets that do exist. You might say that EPFs and all these things exist, but in reality, there's no implementation, especially when you come in the informal sector. Because the truth is, everyone today recognizes the dignity of labor, but no one recognizes the dignity of leisure, where you can take a day off without your wage being cut, where when you're pregnant, you don't have to come to work because you have maternity leaves to fall back on. When you're old and frail, you can walk away with a hefty provident fund. Yet, contract labor exists in millions. They work in the most hazardous conditions simply because they have no other choice. I have a question for the audience. All of us live in the hostels. How many of us know who is actually cleaning our bathrooms in the hostels? Just a quick raise of hands. Thank you. Because every morning when I go to the bathroom, every morning when I use the bathroom, it is essentially a barefoot Dalit woman who's cleaning my bathroom. This is where the whole issue of contract labor becomes much more than just an issue about poverty. It becomes an intersectional issue. In India, the people employed as contract laborers are essentially Dalits, Bahujans, OBC, tribal people who are working because they were historically boxed into certain categories of menial labor. The employers, on the other hand, are not just rich and industrial capitalists, but also often upper caste men. When you go to the US, it's immigrants and people of colors, people from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and even Indians who otherwise don't have any job that make up the workforce of household labor. That essentially means something very simple. You are trapping people into generational cycles of poverty and oppression. There is no way out for them. There's no social ladder for them to climb. Please do not underestimate this argument. When I was desperately trying to be selected as a speaker in this debate, I was exhausting my resources. And a friend helped me out, who is actually seated among us here, who said something that completely changed my perspective on the reform of contract labor. This friend said that their grandmom was actually a bonded labor in the Adilabad village community in the British era. But fortunately enough, the industry of the work was regularized. And today, the grandmom comes to pay the tuition fee of this person who studies in this university. That is the power of social mobility, and that is the power of abolishing contract labor. Second argument that I bring to this debate is the idea that reformed laws are absolutely pointless if there is no scope of implementation. Even if you live in the utopia that our respected opposition speakers want us to believe, where you have dispute resolution mechanism, reformed four labor codes, the simple truth still remains that these laws will simply never be implemented. First, because of shady contract practices. That is to say that an uneducated worker at the end of the day is signing a 48-page contract, as has been discussed before, in English language without really knowing what they're signing up for. And as a matter of practice, these contracts are almost immediately then hidden away, and no one really knows what the legal rights of these workers are in a vast majority of cases. Second, just to add to the discourse that has already been laid out, the consequences of violation are far too low. In the CLRA, the penal provision is that of 6 months of imprisonment. If you violate the rights on a daily basis of 20,000 workers, the likely punishment that happens in the rarest of rare cases, only in cases of gross recurring violation, is a 6 months imprisonment. If I had common sense as an employer and I did a cost benefit analysis, it's far cheaper for me to continue violating the rights of contract laborers. And we think that that itself is a fundamental problem, that it itself is in the implementation. Third is that courts are often very much out of the picture. After all, we know so much about the violation of these labor rights, but how many of these laborers are going to go to the court to fight their cases in a litigation proceeding, right? Even the most recent reformed code, for example, the OSH code of 2020, has fundamentally and structurally kept the court out by codifying things such as sanitation, gardening, and security as non-core activities in order to run an institution. No amount of progressive judicial interpretation can in any way solve this deadlock and add dignity into the work of these laborers if the code itself says otherwise. Even Supreme Court judgments, we've seen Supreme Court judgments where the court has basically washed off its hands by saying that it can merely redirect the issues of contract labor when it comes to judicial review. Therefore, there is absolutely no implementation. And when there is no implementation in a regime, even when the laws are perfect, it becomes very much like this pen that I used to write this long speech that must have bored you out at this point. It becomes pointless. Thank you.
I would like to thank Amisha for a strong response from the government side. And now I would like to request the final speaker of the House, Mr. Devashi Paul, to speak for the side opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, in my limited experience in debating, it has been my observation that this position of being the last speaker of a debate, it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Now, I call it a curse because you have to come to the podium following 6 brilliant speakers who come up with 6 fantastic arguments, research, and worldviews, and that's something that's been very enlightening to me at this point of time. It's also a curse because I'm looking at an audience which is begging to be set free from this debate that has gone on forever. But it's also a blessing because it gives me this very broad overview of what this debate has proceeded so far into. And that's what tells me and gives me insight into what we should actually be discussing about. At this point of time, I have come to the conclusion that both sides completely agree that in the past century, we have observed the contract labor system in India turning problematic. I mean, this is due to exploitative practices by employers, contractors, due to a lack of safety in working conditions. This is something that has been observed on both sides of the debate. What we clash on is how do we resolve this problematic status quo? Rather than abolition, our side advocates for reform. Now, Amisha gave you a medical analogy, and I'll give you one as well. When we visit a doctor on having, injured or dislocated one of our joints or bones, they use this certain medical tool called the orthopedic hammer. Why they use it? It's a very scary tool. It's been used on me. Why they use it is because you have to use brute force to ram your joints back into place, and that's what resolves the issue. At the same time, if a delicate organ of your body like the heart is undergoing some issues, you cannot use this hammer. That's going to be very, very problematic, let me tell you. Your cardiologist will use the finest medical instruments with surgical precision because the room for error is very, very negligible. If we represent our nation's economy and public welfare as a healthy body, one of the posters put up by the Nalsar Welfare Workers Society tells you that the labor force or the workforce is the beating heart of any institution. We cannot drive a hammer through this beating heart. Rather, I advocate for pragmatic and precise surgery, and this is the only thing that can actually resolve these issues at hand. Over the course of the next 5 minutes, what I'll do to you is very simple. I'll demonstrate how at present, why side government is not exactly on the same page as side opposition is because they have identified a very clear problem solution mismatch. We completely agree about what the problem is over here. Both sides of the speakers have done the same thing. What we don't agree about is what the solution to this will be. When they say that the premise of abolition is something that will fix all of the problems at hand, this is something that I'll question before you as an audience. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I've also identified 3 stakeholders in this debate. While Arif rightly said that the primary stakeholders is the contract labor that we're talking about here, we also have to take into account the employer's perspective and also take into account society at large in India that is directly affected by anything and everything that takes place within the regimes of labor. When I say there's a clear problem solution mismatch, how can we look at this very clearly? Just take a hypothetical. If tomorrow we decide that side government is somebody who's making a lot of sense, we decide that abolition is what we should go forward with, and we abolish the contract labor system as it stands. What does this do? As has been told to us repeatedly by speakers from both sides, we have nearly 150 million workers in contractual work positions. This tomorrow upon abolition renders their legal status null and void. What this does is, this does not state that their requirement for livelihood, their requirement to make their ends meet disappears overnight. Let us also be very realistic and take into account that if at present employment and lack of jobs is a crisis that is realistically plaguing India, tomorrow, if all 150 million contractual workers are rendered null and void in terms of contractual labor, the state nor permanent principal employers can absorb them as permanent labor. That's something that is not feasible or realistic. Let's be honest about that. Now, if we cannot do that, what happens to these people? What happens is what happened several decades ago in the US. Prohibition took place, but that did not mean people wanted to stop drinking. What happens is that alcohol then moved to the black market. So now the government is no longer regulating, and there are exploitative prices. There is no standardization of healthy ways of procuring and manufacturing this alcohol. People are falling ill upon consuming this, and this black market is something that's detrimental to each and every stakeholder out here. The exact same thing is what will happen if abolition is what takes place. Why so? Because contractors will continue to exist, contract labor will continue to exist, and if all of these people cannot be subsumed as permanent labor, and that's something that we have to be realistic about. If they cannot be subsumed as permanent workers, what happens is they continue to work in these positions, except this contract doesn't exist anymore. When this contract doesn't exist anymore, this legal remedy that they can fall back on doesn't exist anymore. When they're being paid differential wages right now, with a system in place that is not being implemented correctly, imagine the way that they'll be exploited when there's no system whatsoever. This is a kind of hell that I don't want to even think about in my worst nightmares. That being said, let us look at why this problem solution match is very important to take into account. Sheikh Salahuddin Saab here has recognized two very important issues in his experience. He says that once gig workers who are interacting with app-based startups like Uber, Ola, Swiggy, Zomato, once they're entering into these issues, when they enter into an agreement, all they have to do is enter "I agree" on this contract, and that's where this contract is done. I actually believe this is a very significant problem. He says that workers don't understand these contracts because they are in English, they're in complicated legal terms, and this is something that's very problematic to an illiterate worker or somebody who is functioning in his regional languages. These are problems that, again, cannot be resolved by abolition. What they can be resolved by is firstly making it mandatory, mandating these companies to ensure that these contracts are firstly they deliver physical copies to these workers, that this is kept in the record for the labor officer to inspect, for these registers to be checked on a daily basis. And this is something that can only happen through the route of reform. If all of us actually agree about what the problem over here is, the only way in a democratic setup that we can actually succeed is through reform. We also have recognized that gig economy is something that will not cease to exist tomorrow, right? We know as a fact that there are certain jobs, certain roles, as Section 10 talks about, that Advocate Sudarshan very, very clearly explained to us. Section 10 has spoken about perennial labor, right? So at the same time, what CLRA does is in an interpretation of something that's slightly different than what he has told me right here. CLRA 1970 was firstly built upon Soviet ideals, and it told us that there should be regulation and abolition of contract labor in certain sectors. When you say that there's abolition of contract labor in certain sectors, the parliament has deliberated upon whether or not there should be abolition as a whole. When you're saying that abolition should only be in certain sectors or in certain areas or in certain spheres of work, you're actually legitimizing the ones that are not abolished. When you bring them under the fold of regulation, you have to understand that this is legitimizing this, and my interpretation of the legislative intent of the parliament when they brought in the CLRA is very different from Advocate Sudarshan's. Furthermore, I also must point out that when this is built on Soviet ideals, if we keep thinking that tomorrow, when abolition of contract labor takes place and everyone will be subsumed into public office, into permanent labor jobs, if we are realistic and that does not happen, we'll end up in the same way that the Soviet Union did end up, right? And that's something that's not a very pretty sight. That being said, let's take into account where we stand at present. At present, we have 150 million workers who are in these contractual labor positions. We have several thousands of contractors who are responsible for for the livelihoods and for the way that these contract laborers will be functioning. When Amisha tells you that contract labor system is something that's equivalent to modern slavery, that's something that's equivalent to being as bad as the practice of sati, that's something that I disagree about. I agree that at present, when the contract labor system is at its worst, it's exploitative, it's something that's absolutely at a very bad stage at present. What I disagree about is its essentiality. It's something that is very, very intrinsic to the labor workforce of India. What I can actually equate it to is the license Raj system that existed in the 80s in India, right? Licensing is something that's very important for businesses. Why is it important? Because if a business conducts its operations in the Indian market, the government has to ensure that it's doing so in a free and fair manner. They have to ensure that they're carrying out their businesses according to the laws, and they have to procure licenses for the same. This is a very fair and simple, understandable argument. Why was this such a big evil at that point of time? Because of rampant corruption. To get a license, you have to pay a bribe. So this license Raj system, which is actually for the interest of the public, which is actually for public welfare, which is actually to protect the consumers, it became a huge barrier in India's growth and development because of corruption and because of evil practices. So essentially, the system is not something that's fundamentally problematic. Contract labor is something that will always remain intrinsic to the labor workforce as long as you have the gig economy existing. Regardless of how bad the exploitative practices are, that's not something that actually diminishes the requirement of the existence of the economy. What we need to do is fix and improve the conditions that they are at present in. This can only be done through the route that we are proposing, that is through reforms. What we also tell you is that in the situation wherein we do abolish these reforms, what happens will be something that will be absolutely unthinkable in terms of the result that will accrue out of it. Now, one thing that I need to actually recognize over here is what are the core principles of a democracy, right? We at present have also experienced firsthand when you're trying to struggle and when you're trying to actually ensure that the people of Nalsar, the workers of Nalsar, are given their due. The core principles of a democracy have been seen here when we have discussed, criticized, have raised protests. We have deliberated with the administration, and this continues to a point. Where this will be resolved is when our deliberation and our discussion leads to an agreement that is favorable for the workers, and this is something that will be the result of any healthy democracy. This healthy democratic principle is always delivered in the form of consequent reforms that are healthy for the people who are the stakeholders at hand. I think the best example of who is exemplary in the way that reforms can actually help people and change their lives is Srimati Shantaben's case, who presented this right before you. What this showed us is that the power of discussion, deliberation, and making these people a stakeholder in these discussions is what can actually help us in the long run. If tomorrow abolition takes place, the fundamental problem with this is also not just in terms of the side of the stakeholder, that being the contract laborers, it's also in terms of the side of the employers. While, of course, everyone at the outset does not really sympathize with that side of it, because corporates are at a pedestal above us. They're at a pedestal wherein they're operating in the businesses of thousands of crores. So that's understandable that they're at a separate level. They're a separate stakeholder. But they also have to be a necessary stakeholder in this, because they are the ones who are generating these millions of jobs. Now, in the scenario that contract labor is abolished tomorrow, what does a business do? A business always operates on reason. It always operates where there is a possibility of profit and where there isn't. What we have to do is find the middle ground between this. If tomorrow abolition does take place, and contract labor cannot be hired by a business to build a project that will take 1 month if they have 10 contractual workers. They instead will hire 2 permanent workers who will continue working for 6 months, and the business fails to grow because, they're not really building projects at the rate that's required to. At the same time, there are these 8 people who are now rendered jobless, who have to look for economy because they continue to need to make their ends meet. What they do is they come to the black market. And this is something that, again, I implore you, is deeply problematic for this nation. In conclusion, I'd like to say one thing, that at this present time in hand, contract labor is something that I see as a necessary evil. And this will continue to just be necessary because this evil aspect of it can be eliminated if we can simply carry out free and fair reforms that take into account all of the stakeholders that we have present here on this very table. If we do take into account all of these points from the employers, points from the perspective of the contract labor, and points that will actually benefit the society at large and help us grow in a direction that is where we want to achieve, this is the one route that will actually help us take India to a sort of destination that we all want to see ourselves in. I am very, very proud to oppose this motion, and I would like to propose that contract labor should be reformed. Thank you.
I would like to thank all 7 speakers of the House once again for contributing to this valuable discussions. We heard the voices of multiple perspectives in this debate. We heard the voice of an activist, we heard the voice of a lawyer, we heard the voice of an employer, and we heard the voice of a student, displaying the whole purpose of this event at the first place. We started this debate with the side being against the motion by 2 votes. And before going for the closing vote, I would like to ask if there are any questions to any of the panelists in the given situation. Okay, considering that there are no particular questions that are here being asked, we can go for the closing vote. Right now, I would like to ask everyone for the motion after the debate to please show a rise of hands. So with that being said, I would like everyone against the motion to please show a rise of hands. So we have a huge marginal differential of around 18 votes against the motion to what it was started as just 2 votes against the motion. With that being said, we believe that the audience in the house and in the online platforms have increased the scope of their perspective on these issues faced by contractual labor. And we as organizers believe that we have faithfully contributed to this dialogue on worker welfare. With that, I would like to conclude the house. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to the students of Nalsar for organizing such an pertinent issue, a debate on such a pertinent issue. I just want to explain, whatever they have discussed, from my 21 years of experience, I just want to explain this issue just within few minutes. Many of you, let's be very frank, many of you before joining Nalsar probably were in a very serious relationship, but did your parents allow you to marry during that time? Did you agree to marry each other during that time? Because time is very important. Time is very important. All of you will marry once you are stable, you are confirmed that you have reached a certain position in your life, and now you can marry. Similar situation actually our country has been going through. So contract labor forever, it should not be continued. But in the present situation, if we suddenly abolish this issue, contract labor facility, then the industry will be facing huge problem. And simple mathematics that suppose, a company's kitty, salary kitty is suppose say 1 crore. And they have suppose, 100 regular employees and 200 contractor employees. Now the point is that if suddenly they remove all the contractor employees, they cannot take 200 regular employees with that cost. So what will happen? The company will be facing huge problem, to exist, to survive. Probably the company will be closed down. So what will happen? Not only the contractor employees, even the regular employees will also lose their job. And that will have huge, adverse impact on the country's economy. So time is very important. Right now, India has been going through a fantastic time when lots of initiatives, I'm very confidently I'm telling you, because some speakers, they are extremely unhappy, but with our practical experience, I can tell you, we have no trade union background, we have no political background. We are absolutely apolitical. We only love our country. And it's humble request to all of you that, if we really love our country, we should not be biased towards any political party. Whoever will do good for common people, for the country, we should support them. Last, few years, I have noticed that the government has been working relentlessly, to implement and to, enhance the different monitoring mechanism to reduce corruption and to implement the act. Acts were prevailing since last, 1970s, 1948, all these labor acts were available. But unfortunately, those are not implemented properly. And there's a huge reason because lots of people exploited the poor people. Although these people are now crying for those poor people, but they actually, they exploited these poor people the most actually. And gradually, the trade union concept has, evaporated from India because of that exploitative attitude. I'm sorry to say this, but I want to be very straightforward and blunt because no point, keeping things under the carpet. So now what's happening? The government is, implementing very fast, and also I'm giving another example for Indian Oil. Indian Oil has suppose, so many employees, contractor employees. Now they have only Holdia refinery. They have around 300, I think, contractors. So for statutory, authority. They don't have so many inspectors, so many managers. I want water. Sorry. They don't have so many, that kind of mechanism that they can check that 300, contractors, whether they are paying all the benefits to their employees. But as they are contractor of Indian Oil, what government is doing, they are coming to Indian Oil, they are requesting Indian Oil to show all the records. Indian Oil, as principal employer, they are supposed to maintain each and every information pertaining to all the contractor employees. Sorry. Okay. Just 1 minute. Pertaining to each and every employees. And when the inspector is coming, they are actually providing, they are checking from Indian Oil that whether all the employees, contractor employees, they are getting all the social security benefits or not. So that's the way. Otherwise, if suppose, they become independent, employer, all the small contractor employers, contractors, then what will happen? It's impossible for government to have install a proper monitoring mechanism to ensure that all the employees are getting their PF, ESS, leave encashment, gratuity, all these benefits. So suddenly, if we think that abolishing contractor, this act will resolve the issue, I think that's not correct. So that's why my personal opinion that, right now we are not in a position to support that abolition. Maybe after 15 years, we can think about that. And for that, actually, we have to work collectively and we have to protect everyone's, interest. Thank you.
I'll just take 1 minute and then. So, Anisha, what you mentioned about punishments is actually outdated because the labor books have not been updated. Today, for a simple non-maintenance of register, under the Contract Labor Act, all the directors of a company can be charged 30,000 rupees per director per register. And large companies like Indian Oil have ended up paying 100 crores. And large MNCs like Group 4 Security are still under the proceedings from the EPFO to pay 100 crores for non-implementation of Provident Fund on universal allowances. So what you're reading in the labor books is not a reflection of the offenses, which is why, many companies like Sequel today are being asked to audit contractor compliance before their bills are released, and we have to check evidence of payment, right? So just wanted, and you spoke so well, but I just thought I should let you know that today the offenses are not limited to imprisonment. Government has done away with imprisonment under ease of doing business unless there is clear evasion. Like, you're deducting a provident fund and not depositing, that is criminal, not otherwise.
I'm slightly disappointed, but life goes on. There are always bouquets and brickbats. I'll just give one example. 23rd March, 8 o'clock, the Prime Minister announced lockdown, 2020. You have seen the plight of the migrant workers. The so-called employers, 99% of the employers in this country have not paid wages to the workers for the days they have worked, not for the days they have not worked. 99% they have not paid. When the union government announced, they went to the Supreme Court and they got a stay. The Chief Minister of the Telangana state announced, and again they went and got a stay there. I can only say, the tears in the eyes of a rat will not melt the heart of the cat. Cat always thinks, how can I eat this rat? I can make it rat 65 or rat Manchuria, or I can eat it like, half boil or half fry. So sometimes I feel, people talk, I think they are from a different planet. I'm sorry to say this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. There's lemonade and Maggie outside. You can